Today we're going to dissect a video from the Business and Climate Summit held in 2016 in London. Now the video is starring Suncor CEO Steve Williams and anti-Canadian former Alberta government employee Sephora Berman. You won't believe how long their working relationship goes back. It's way further than you think. And we learn a startling new fact about Rachel Notley's previous relationship with Berman. The Business and Climate Summit website describes the annual event as the leading annual forum for businesses, investors, and policymakers on climate action. You know what? That sounds like a special level of hell to me, but let's carry on. I'm led to believe this thing is where, and I'm quoting here, businesses and governments come together to agree on a roadmap for reaching net zero emissions over the next half century and demonstrate how low carbon strategies are good for businesses and good for growth and builds the partnerships needed to scale up and accelerate the low carbon transition. Okay, so businesses and government are getting together to tell me how to live. And they're repeating that debunked lie that a low carbon economy means growth. When in Alberta, we can clearly see that phasing out coal and putting in emissions caps and blocking pipelines and blocking oil sands development, well, that sort of stuff is putting us in the poorhouse, but I'll get to that point a little later on in my report. This Business and Climate Summit is the very same conference where Sephora Berman made those comments about Fort McMurray being Mordor. Let me refresh your memory here.
The tar sands are the single largest and most destructive industrial project on Earth. So when you're there, it feels a bit like Mordor. It's, as far as the eye can see, mines.
Now, what I really want to show you are portions from a 3-person panel discussion held June 28th, 2016. The session was titled, Bold New Climate Policy in Canada's Oil Sands. Oil companies and environmental organizations are creating new conversations about decarbonization in a resource-rich economy. And it stars our old friend, Sephora, everything I don't like is Mordor Berman. Well, that's no surprise to see her face at something like this. But what's a little startling is who her co-panelist is in this intimate and very friendly fireside chat. It should also be very troubling for Suncor Energy shareholders that the president and CEO of Suncor Energy joined Berman as she promoted the end of oil and gas in Alberta to a London crowd of do-gooders. But that is exactly what happened here. Today, I'm going to go through some of what was said and what I learned while watching a foreign-funded BC-based activist who was once on the Alberta government payroll and her Oilman CEO cohort plot the end of hundreds of thousands of Canadian jobs to a friendly foreign audience. We learned a lot right off the bat. Look at how far back the relationship between Berman and Williams goes here.
I suppose it started about 2 years ago. For those of you who don't know, climate policy in Canada has been paralyzed, to put it mildly, for many years. And we were embroiled, and I think still are, in incredibly contentious debates about pipelines, about the future of the oil sands. A group of us got together and started having conversations quietly. And I suppose at the beginning, for me, coming from a background of designing environmental campaigns for the last 25 years, I was just really curious to try and understand what these clearly highly accomplished and successful businessmen thought about climate change. It really felt to me, coming from the environmental community, that part of the reason we were being held back in Canada on climate policy was because of the opposition to climate policy from the fossil fuel industry. And I wanted to understand what you thought about climate change and what you thought about Canada's role and what we could do. And so we started having conversations, and it led to some pretty interesting breakthroughs. We realized that we share a lot of common ground. We all believed, the CEOs and the executive directors of environmental organizations, that Canada should lead, that we wanted Canada to have a strong economy, that we all believed in climate change, The question was, what is Canada's fair share? Therefore, what is the oil sands' fair share? What do we do with an economy like Alberta's that is 70% dependent on oil?
So Berman started meeting with Williams and other unidentified oil patch CEOs 2 years from this 2016 summit, back in 2014. And back in 2014, the rest of the country was fighting so hard for the now canceled Northern Gateway pipeline. And we were fighting against Berman to get it done and get our oil offshore and keep our economy out of the mess it eventually fell into. And in the meantime, Williams and a bunch of other nameless, faceless oil patch CEOs were meeting with the enemy in private. Right away, Berman drops another bomb here.
And we worked with the Alberta government to draft and design a climate plan. That climate plan was announced last November. Alberta became one of the first jurisdictions in the world, oil-producing jurisdiction, to put a cap on emissions of 100 million tons from the oil sands. We put an economy-wide price on carbon at $30, and also a commitment to phase out coal by 2030. A renewable portfolio standard, 30% by 2030, and a commitment to reduce methane 45% by 2025. This is a jurisdiction that not only didn't have climate policy in the past at all, but in fact was embroiled in a conversation of whether climate change is real. So that's kind of an introduction to the process and what we've achieved so far.
Berman said she worked directly with the Alberta government to draft the Climate Leadership Plan in 2015. Now, that would be well before she was ever on the Oil Sands Advisory Group. That's absolutely something we didn't know before. Berman said she was instrumental in imposing the carbon tax on Albertans. Now, let's get to Williams. I want to show you this quick clip, or series of clips, of Williams telling us all the things he agrees with Berman on, or at least some of the things he does. Here.
You know, what is this conversation about? It's about climate change. So that agreement on climate change is very important at the beginning. It's an agreement that CO2 is a major contributor to climate change and that therefore fossil fuels is a major contributor. But if you can start to solve some of those issues, and it doesn't mean you have the perfect resolution, but if you can start to solve some of those issues, you can make real progress. And by the way, the next stage gets even more uncomfortable because it's about a big consumption issue. So we've got to involve the general population in it. And that's why particularly I like the broad-based carbon tax, because it forces that conversation to happen on a consumption and a demand front. I actually support stranded assets. It helps me going forward. I think it's one of the breakthroughs in the last 2 or 3 years is to try and regulate a global carbon price is almost impossible jurisdictionally. It's best to start local, set challenges and try and build it up. And the speed with which we've been able to move has surprised us.
This feels like Williams is a true believer and not someone suffering from Stockholm syndrome. He's so enthusiastic for you and I to pay a carbon tax so that his company can get government subsidies from the tax collected so that they can be more efficient. Do you really think Steve Williams is going to be making any hard personal choices in his lifestyle to adjust to his beloved carbon tax like the rest of us are? Of course he likes the carbon tax. He can afford it. He thinks the rest of us are just a bunch of inefficient rubes running our furnaces too high. So we need his help and the help of Mother Government to make sure we shiver around the house at a chilly 63 degrees Fahrenheit. And how nice of Steve Williams to want to include us, the public, in the next part of his conversations. How generous of him to allow us a say in our own lives. The arrogance of this guy, it's unreal. And stranded assets? Well, that's just SJW oil man talk for the environmentalist mantra of leave it in the ground, leave it in the ground. On that 2016 panel, Steve Williams was full SJW meets Catherine McKenna's nonsensical mumbo jumbo about leading the world by taxing the people. Here.
What we challenged ourselves with is let's become the leader in the world. And then that's a much better position to take this conversation in, and we'll challenge the rest of the world to come with us. So in order, because we were behind, we had to prove some things. You know, we were viewed to be one of the bad guys in the world around, you know, what was called the tar sands. And our view that
we,
was...
you mean Alberta or Suncor?
No, the industry, right. To an extent Alberta, to an extent Canada. Yeah. And our belief was, that's not perfectly justified. Let's try and jump to a different position to demonstrate what we truly stand for. So what we've done is move to global best practice. I don't think there's another basin in the world which has an emissions cap on it, so we've set a standard. We've moved to, we've talked about 30 with potential escalators up further, but we're challenging the world to come with us, because there's not a naivety, you know, if all we do is disadvantage Canada, that's not the right answer. One of the profound beliefs we have underneath this is that the best way to have a healthy environment is to have a healthy economy. And the best way to have a healthy economy is to have a healthy environment. And if those two don't go together, then one of them will likely suffer. So, you know, this is not an attempt to completely make Canada uncompetitive. We want to be at the leading edge so we can lead this debate and start to shape it and challenge people to come with us. But we recognize we've got to get some movement. So, you know, right now in Toronto and Ottawa today, President Obama is there with Trudeau, with the president of Mexico, talking about a North American energy strategy to challenge them. Right, now come with us. We've set the standard, come with us.
Don't you see? This is a pride thing for Williams. It's a virtue signaling thing, and he admits as much. Instead of talking about the incredible work we do in the oil patch, the good jobs it provides, he wants to buy favor by being the biggest SJW in oil and gas. He internalized all the mean and unscientific things environmentalists have said about Alberta instead of fighting the lies with truth. I think Williams was banking on Hillary Clinton to be president with all that leading the pack talk. In 2018, Canada is quickly falling behind economically as the Americans gobble up our market share and export their own oil and gas, while drastically cutting CO2 emissions without their own carbon tax. Well done, Steve Williams. Now, I like President Trump, but Sephora Berman and Steve here, well, they seem to be his best oil and gas salesmen, don't they? We also learn about the economic effect and the real reason for Rachel Notley's 100 megaton emissions cap on oil sands projects here.
I think that the 100 million ton cap is, in effect, one of the first pieces of keep it in the ground legislation, because, you know, we had a former Prime Minister Harper, who was arguing that Canada should produce 9 million barrels a day of oil sands. We have 7.4 million barrels per day either approved or in the approval system. 100 million tons is somewhere between 3 and 4. So with current technology, this emissions cap has essentially mothballed at least a third of the already approved permits.
Did you get that? 1 in 3 projects will be destroyed by Rachel Notley's oil sands emissions cap. It's a leave it in the ground legislation by another name. And that became regulation at the behest of this BC-based kook Berman. Now that's the unhinged quackery of a summit of busybodies, know-nothings and academics and CEOs in London in 2016. Back in reality of Alberta in 2016, Encana announced that it would cut its workforce by 20%, carving out at least 500 jobs off their company payroll. Calfrac Well Services announced that it had laid off more than 1,700 employees from its Canadian and U.S. workforce, reducing its staff by 40% in Canada, as they said they faced the worst oil patch downturn in 3 decades. Cenovus Energy cut 440 jobs in the first part of 2016, and Devon Energy cut 20% of its staff after it already laid off 200 people the previous fall. In a CBC report just a week after Berman and Williams' panel, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers and Enform used a multiplier of 2.5 to calculate oil patch-related job losses, meaning for every direct job that's been cut in the patch, 2.5 indirect jobs have also been lost. Those are people who work in the hotels, people who work at the grocery store, the clothing store, pump the gas, people who work in restaurants, people who work in support industries to provide services to those who work in the oil and gas industry. They are the trickle-down economy. Now, using that 2.5 calculation, at the same time Steve Williams and Sephora Berman were talking about how their collaboration on climate creates jobs, the reality on the ground was that the overall job losses in Alberta then were around 110,000 workers. Oh, and where is Steve Williams today, 2 years later, in the middle of this disaster after another canceled pipeline? Well, Williams is either talking out of both sides of his mouth on the issue of approvals, or he's being mugged by the reality of his strange kabuki dance with Canada's most anti-oil environmentalist, one who now claims gleeful responsibility for the death of the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion project. And I suppose only Steve Williams knows the true truth about which one it is. In yesterday's Globe and Mail, Williams said that Suncor Energy will not approve any more projects or expansions of projects for crude oil production until he has more clarity on pipelines. Williams said there is a question of confidence in Canada. Yes, Mr. Williams, there certainly is a decline in investor confidence here in beautiful Alberta, and you have spent the better part of the last 2 years as part of the problem. Actually, you know what? It's closer to 4 now, isn't it? Well, people like my friend Robbie Picard travel the country on their own dime, advocating for oil and gas jobs and the ethical, clean nature of Canadian oil and gas. Williams is trotting the globe with someone who desperately hates Alberta and hates Canada to say the exact opposite to crowds of adoring yet ignorant fancy people who will never be touched by these horrific layoffs in their cushy academic or government-protected lives. I don't advocate for Steve Williams or any of those other unnamed oil field CEOs who don't give a rip about the people they're going to lay off because they teamed up with anti-oil activists to buy some of Rachel Notley's completely non-existent social license. Families are getting hurt while environmentalists and CEOs like Steve Williams are laughing all the way to the bank. For the Rebel.media, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. What you just saw there is the daily video that I do here at The Rebel, but did you know that I also have my own weekly full-length show? It's called The Gun Show, and I talk to interesting newsmakers and activists and game changers about issues affecting Canadians. But to get access to my show and the rest of our truly incredible premium content, treat yourself to a Rebel subscription today.